The whispers followed her everywhere. Even here, in a place where nobody knew her name, Eleanor Mitchell could feel the stares burning into her skin, like the flames once had. Her fingers trembled as she stepped off the train at Riverton's crossing, clutching a letter that promised a new beginning at Whispering Pines Ranch. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra. Special for you! She pulled her shawl higher to cover the right side of her face, a habit formed after the Boston schoolhouse fire that had claimed her smooth skin, but spared the children in her care. The platform was nearly empty, except for a stationmaster and a tall man with a wagon who took one look at her scarred profile and turned away, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, miss," he said without meeting her eyes. "Thomas Cooper sent me to collect a bride, not—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Eleanor knew what he couldn't say. Not damaged goods, not someone who would make people stare, not someone whose face would frighten children. The man climbed back onto his wagon, leaving her alone with her single trunk and shattered hopes before she'd even had a chance to begin. Wyoming Territory had never been kind to the faint of heart. The winter of 1876 had been particularly brutal, stripping the land bare and testing even the most seasoned settlers. Whispering Pines Ranch stood, defiant against the backdrop of snow-covered foothills, though its resilience had come at a price. The west wing of the two-story cabin remained a charred reminder of what had been lost 2 years earlier, when lightning struck during a summer storm, setting the dry timber ablaze. Thomas Cooper moved through his morning chores with the efficiency of a man who'd learned to work around his limitations. The scarred flesh of his left hand and forearm pulled tight when he lifted hay bales, a constant reminder of the night he'd rushed into the burning stable to save his prized stallion. The horse had survived. Thomas had emerged with more than just physical scars. The ranch had been his dream, built with the money saved during his years as a Union soldier. Now it was just him and Matthew, struggling to keep the cattle fed and the fences mended. "Mail's here," Matthew called, riding into the yard with a small bundle of envelopes. "Including a letter from that woman in Boston?" Thomas grunted, wiping his good hand across his brow. "She still coming?" "Says so. Train. Arrives next Tuesday." Matthew hesitated. "You sure about this, Thomas? A mail-order bride after Caroline?" "Don't." Thomas cut him off. "Caroline left because she couldn't stand looking at this." He held up his scarred hand. "Can't run this place alone. Need a practical woman who understands that marriage is about work, not pretty faces or pretty words." "And you told her? About—" Matthew gestured vaguely at Thomas's scars. "Told her I was injured. Told her this is hard country. Told her I need a wife, not a China doll." Thomas turned back to the hay. "If she's coming all the way from Boston for this, she must be desperate or practical. Either way, she'll do." What Thomas hadn't written in his letters was how the loneliness ate at him worse than the pain ever had. How the town's pitying glances when he rode in for supplies made him feel like less of a man. How he sometimes stood at the edge of his property in the gathering dusk and wondered if he'd made a mistake, trying to carve something meaningful out of this unforgiving land. In Boston, Eleanor Mitchell carefully folded the last of her belongings into a worn trunk. The small boarding house room had been home since the fire had taken both her position at the school and her place in society. No one wanted their children, taught by a woman whose appearance frightened them, no matter how many of those same children she'd carried to safety. "You don't have to go, Ellie," her friend Mary said from the doorway. "Surely there are other positions. Perhaps the new library." Eleanor touched the right side of her face, fingers tracing the rippled skin that stretched from her temple to her jaw. "We both know there aren't. Not for me. Not anymore." She smiled with the left side of her mouth, the side that still worked properly. Besides, his letters were honest. He needs help with his ranch. He doesn't need beauty. She didn't show Mary the letters from Thomas Cooper, didn't share how his blunt, practical words had given her more hope than all the pitying looks and empty promises she'd received in Boston. He'd written about hard work and harsh weather, about cattle and crops, and the need for someone who could keep accounts and help birth calves if needed. Not once had he mentioned beauty or companionship or love. "What if he's horrified when he sees you?" Mary asked, her concern genuine. Eleanor closed the trunk with a decisive click. "Then I'll find another way. But a man who writes about needing a wife who can render lard and mend fences isn't looking for a pretty face." She straightened her shoulders. "And I need somewhere. I can be useful again." What Eleanor didn't say was that she'd stopped looking in mirrors after the fire, that she'd memorized the way people's eyes slid away from her face, that she'd learned to turn her good side toward those she spoke with, to spare them the discomfort of seeing what the flames had done to her. That even after 2 years, she sometimes woke gasping for breath, convinced she was still trapped in that burning schoolhouse. The stagecoach journey west had been long, dusty, and uncomfortable. With each mile, Eleanor rehearsed what she would say when Thomas Cooper first saw her. How she would stand straight and meet his eyes, how she would speak clearly about her skills and strengths, how she would not flinch if his gaze flickered away from her scars. But Thomas Cooper wasn't at the station, just his ranch hand with a wagon and an inability to hide his shock. "Please," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "At least take me to meet Mr. Cooper. I've come a long way. Let him decide." The man, who had introduced himself as Matthew Hayes, shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I don't think—" "I didn't ask what you think," Eleanor said, summoning the voice she'd once used to bring rowdy schoolboys to order. "I asked you to take me to the man who wrote me these letters." She held up the bundle of correspondence that had brought her across the country. "The man who said he needed a practical wife, who wasn't afraid of hard work." Matthew's face flushed. He looked down at his boots, then back at her face, his eyes skittering away from her scars. "Yes, ma'am." The ride to Whispering Pines Ranch passed in uncomfortable silence. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the landscape, drinking in the sight of pine-covered hills and open skies. Whatever happened next, at least she'd seen a different world than the narrow streets of Boston. Thomas Cooper was mending a fence when the wagon pulled into the yard. He straightened, shading his eyes against the late afternoon sun. A woman sat beside Matthew, her posture rigid, her face partially hidden by the angle of her bonnet. "Mr. Cooper," Matthew called, pulling the wagon to a stop. "Miss Eleanor Mitchell from Boston." Thomas wiped his hand on his trousers and approached the wagon. "Miss Mitchell, didn't expect Matthew to bring you straight out. Town's usually where new arrivals stay until—" He stopped abruptly as Eleanor turned to face him fully. The right side of her face was a landscape of scars, pulling her eyes slightly downward, twisting her mouth into a permanent half-grimace. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. "Mr. Cooper," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I understand if this isn't what you expected. Your man made it quite clear at the station. I can return on tomorrow's train if you wish." Thomas's gaze didn't waver from her face. Then, with deliberate slowness, he removed his glove and held up his left hand, a mass of twisted scar tissue from palm to elbow. "Lightning hit the stable 2 summers back," he said matter-of-factly. "Caught fire faster than anything I'd ever seen. Got the horses out, but—" He shrugged. "Reckon we've both seen flames up close, Miss Mitchell." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Something shifted in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of understanding. "Schoolhouse fire," she said simply. "The children all got out." Thomas nodded once, as if that explained everything that needed explaining. Can you cook? Yes. Read and figure? I was a teacher. Afraid of hard work? No, Mr. Cooper. Thomas looked at her for another long moment, then turned to Matthew. Get Miss Mitchell's trunk. Supper's in an hour. He turned back to Eleanor. There's a room ready in the house. East side. West wing's still being rebuilt after the fire. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor stepped down from the wagon without assistance, her legs stiff from the long journey. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Thomas, he corrected, already turning back to his fence work. If you're staying, it's Thomas. The house was simple but solid, with the clean, sparse look of a place inhabited by men who valued function over comfort. The east wing smelled of pine and soap, while the partially rebuilt west wing carried the lingering scent of char and new timber. Eleanor's room was small, but had a window that looked out over rolling hills dotted with pine. A narrow bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and a small desk filled the space. Someone had placed a bunch of wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill, Matthew's doing, she suspected, perhaps as an apology. Eleanor unpacked quickly, arranging her few possessions with the precision that had become second nature after years of teaching. She changed into a clean dress, splashed water on her face, and pinned her hair back neatly. She didn't try to hide her scars. There seemed little point now. The kitchen was empty when she found it, but a fire burned in the stove and vegetables sat half-prepared on a scarred wooden table. Eleanor rolled up her sleeves and set to work, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of cutting and stirring. By the time boots sounded on the porch, she had a pot of stew simmering and biscuits in the oven. Thomas entered first, stopping short at the doorway. You've been busy. Seemed the practical thing to do, Eleanor replied, wiping her hands on a cloth. Dinner will be ready soon. Matthew followed, his eyes widening at the sight of the set, table and bubbling pot. Well now, this is more like it. He caught Thomas's sharp look and cleared his throat. I mean, thank you, Miss Mitchell. Eleanor, she corrected. Or Ellie, if you prefer. They ate in silence at first, the clinking of spoons against bowls, the only sound. Eleanor kept her eyes on her food, aware of the occasional glances from both men. This is good, Thomas said finally. Better than what we manage. Thank you, Eleanor said. Tomorrow I'll need to see what supplies you have, what needs to be ordered. Already making plans to stay? Thomas asked, his tone neutral. Eleanor met his gaze directly. You haven't asked me to leave. No. Thomas studied her for a moment longer. I haven't. Later, standing on the porch while the men finished evening chores, Eleanor let herself acknowledge the trembling in her hands. She'd survived the first meeting, the first meal. Thomas hadn't recoiled from her scars. But neither had he said anything but the arrangement they'd discussed in their letters. The marriage that was to give her a home and him a partner in running the ranch. The sun was setting behind the pines, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The beauty of it caught in Eleanor's throat. Boston had its charms, but nothing like this wild openness, this sense of endless possibility stretching to the horizon. The creak of the porch step announced Thomas's approach. He stood beside her, not too close, both of them facing the sunset rather than each other. Why did you come all this way? He asked after a long silence. Truth now. Eleanor considered her answer carefully. Because I can't be what I was before the fire. And Boston wouldn't let me be anything else. Thomas nodded slowly. And what? Do you want here? Purpose, Eleanor said simply. Work that matters. A place where I'm judged by what I can do, not by... She gestured vaguely toward her face. And marriage? That was part of the arrangement. Eleanor turned to look at him then, taking in his weathered face, the set of his jaw, the way he held his scarred hand slightly away from his body, as if even after all this time he was conscious of it. "I came prepared to honor that arrangement," she said steadily, "but I understand if seeing me has changed your mind." Thomas's laugh held no humor. "Miss Mitchell, if I judge folks by their scars, I'd have to start by hanging myself." He looked down at his twisted hand. "Marriage wasn't my idea at first. Doc Grant and Mrs. Barnes from town kept pushing me to find someone. Said a man needs a wife, a ranch needs a woman's touch," he shrugged. "Fought them on it until last winter when I took sick and nearly lost the place because I was too weak to work. Made me realize they might be right." Eleanor nodded. His practical reasoning matched what she'd read in his letters. "So what happens now?" "Now we see if this works," Thomas said. "A week. You keep house, help where you can. I show you what running this place means. At the end, if either of us says no, I'll pay your way back to Boston. And if we both say yes, then we ride into town, see the preacher, make it official." Thomas turned to face her. "No false promises, Eleanor. This won't be easy. The work is hard, the winters are brutal, and sometimes the land takes more than it gives. I'm not a gentleman, nor a charming one. I'm not looking for gentle or charming," Eleanor replied. "I'm looking for honest. And so far, Mr. Cooper, you've been that." Thomas held out his right hand, his whole one. "Then we have an agreement." Eleanor placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses against her palm. "We do." That night, lying in the narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Wyoming wilderness, Eleanor allowed herself to consider the possibility that she'd found the one place where her scars might not define her, where a man could look at her ruined face and see something worth keeping. Not beauty, perhaps, but value. It wasn't love. She hadn't come looking for that fairy tale. But it was a chance. And that was more than Boston had offered since the day the schoolhouse burned. Eleanor woke before dawn, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling above her bed. The events of yesterday flooded back. The humiliating rejection at the train station, the unexpected understanding in Thomas Cooper's eyes when he showed her his own scarred hand, their tentative agreement to see if they could build something practical from the ashes of their former lives. She dressed quickly in her most serviceable dress, pinned her hair in a simple knot, and made her way to the kitchen, determined to prove her worth from the first hour. The kitchen was cold, the previous night's fire reduced to embers. Eleanor worked methodically, building up the fire, setting coffee to boil, and surveying the pantry with a teacher's critical eye. The supplies were basic but adequate. Flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, salt pork, and shelves of home-canned vegetables and fruits that must have come from a neighbor, as there was no garden visible on the property. By the time boots sounded, on the porch she had biscuits in the oven, bacon frying, and a pot of oatmeal simmering on the back of the stove. The coffee was strong enough to stand a spoon in, just as her father had always taken it. Matthew entered first, stopping short at the sight of her standing at the stove. His eyes darted to her scars, then quickly away. "Morning, Miss Mitchell. Didn't expect to see you up so early." "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice pleasant and professional. "Breakfast will be ready shortly. There's coffee if you'd like some." Thomas followed a moment later, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the kitchen. "You're up early." "I've always found it best to begin as one means to go on," Eleanor said, sliding biscuits from the oven. "I wasn't sure what time you started your day." "First light usually," Thomas said, pouring himself coffee. He took a deep swallow, eyebrows rising slightly. "Strong." "Too strong?" Eleanor asked, suddenly uncertain. The corner of Thomas's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "No, it's good." He glanced at the bubbling pots. This is a good start, but I should show you the rest of the ranch after breakfast. You need to understand what you're considering taking on." They ate quickly, the meal punctuated by brief exchanges about the day's work. Matthew seemed to relax slightly as the meal progressed, though his gaze still skittered away from Eleanor's face whenever they made eye contact. Thomas ate methodically, his attention more on the mental list of tasks ahead than on the food or company. After breakfast, Eleanor insisted on cleaning up alone. "You have work to do," she said, when Thomas hesitated. "I'll join you outside when I'm finished here." The kitchen window provided a view of the yard, where Thomas was repairing a wagon wheel while Matthew saddled horses. Eleanor watched the precise way Thomas adapted his movements to accommodate his injured hand, never wasting motion, never allowing the scarred limb to prevent him from completing a task. There was something compelling about his efficiency, his refusal to be limited. By mid-morning, Eleanor had become acquainted with the chicken coop, 6 laying hens sadly neglected, the vegetable plot, overgrown with weeds but salvageable, the smokehouse, the spring house, and the tool shed. Thomas spoke little as he showed her around, simply pointing out what worked and what needed attention. "The property runs about 2,000 acres, he explained, as they paused at the edge of a fenced pasture where cattle grazed in the distance. Good water from the creek year-round, rocky soil in some places, but it grows decent grass. Been running about 200 head of cattle, though we lost some in last winter's storms. It's beautiful," Eleanor said honestly, taking in the sweep of land rising toward pine-covered hills. Thomas glanced at her sharply, as if checking for insincerity, then gave a short nod. "Has its moments." He turned toward a path leading up, a gentle slope. "West wing of the house still needs work. Lightning hit 2 summers ago during a dry spell. Spread fast." They climbed in silence until they reached the house, approaching from the damaged western side. The charred timbers had been removed, new framing erected, but much remained to be done. Thomas ran his good hand along a newly installed support beam. "Been working on it when I can spare time from the cattle. Matthew helps, but it's slow going." Eleanor studied the partially rebuilt structure, mentally calculating what would be needed to complete it. "What will this section be when it's finished?" 2 more bedrooms, maybe a proper sitting room. Thomas kept his eyes on the construction. "Was thinking of children when I started rebuilding, before the fire." The simple admission hung in, the air between them. Eleanor's hand moved unconsciously to touch her scarred cheek. "You were married before?" "Engaged," Thomas corrected. "Caroline was the banker's daughter from Riverton's crossing. Pretty girl. Had ideas about being a cattle baron's wife." His mouth twisted. "Fire changed things. Changed me. She couldn't bear to look at this." He held up his scarred hand. "Said she tried, but every time she saw it, she remembered pulling me from the burning stable, remembered the smell of burning flesh." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." Thomas shrugged. She was honest, at least. Better than pity. He turned to face her directly. "That's why I wrote to you, Eleanor, not looking for someone to pretend these scars don't exist. Looking for someone practical enough to see past them to the work that needs doing." "And is that what you see when you look at me?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Someone practical enough to see past scars?" Thomas's gaze didn't waver from her face. "I see someone who saved children from a fire and came 2,000 miles to build a new life. Seems plenty strong to me." Something warm unfurled in Eleanor's chest. Not gratitude, but a tentative respect. She straightened her shoulders. "Then show me the rest of what needs doing, Mr. Cooper. If I'm to make a decision in a week's time, I'll need to understand everything about this place." They spent the remainder of the morning touring the barn, the corrals, and the outbuildings. Thomas explained the seasonal rhythm of ranch work. Carving in spring, branding in early summer, haying in late summer, the fall gather when cattle were brought down from summer pastures, and the hard winter months when simply keeping animals alive required constant vigilance. By midday, Eleanor's city shoes had collected a layer of dust, her skirts had caught on fence posts twice, and she'd developed a new appreciation for the sheer physical demands of ranch life. When Thomas suggested they return to the house for the noon meal, she welcomed the chance to rest her feet. Matthew was waiting for them in the yard, looking uncomfortable. "Riders coming," he said with a nod toward the road. "Clara Wilson and the doc." Thomas's expression darkened. Word travels fast. "The station master saw Miss Mitchell arrive," Matthew explained with an apologetic glance at Eleanor. "Must have mentioned it in town." Eleanor smoothed her hair and brushed at the dust on her skirt. "Should I make coffee?" "Better make plenty," Thomas said grimly. "Once Clara Wilson's been here, half the town will find excuses to ride out by sunset." The visitors arrived moments later, a plump woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a pleasant face, accompanied by an older man with a trim beard and spectacles. They reined their horses to a stop in the yard, their curious gazes immediately finding Eleanor. "Thomas Cooper, you might have told us your bride was arriving yesterday," the woman exclaimed, dismounting with surprising agility. "We'd have arranged a proper welcome." "Miss Mitchell is here on a trial basis, Clara," Thomas said, stepping forward to help the doctor down. "Doc Grant, she's not in need of your services." The doctor chuckled. "I'm here as a neighbor, Thomas, not a physician." He extended his hand to Eleanor. "Samuel Grant, Miss Mitchell, welcome to our little corner of Wyoming." Eleanor took his hand, deliberately turning so that her scarred profile was clearly visible. "Thank you, Dr. Grant. It's a pleasure to meet you." To his credit, the doctor's expression remained pleasant, though his eyes widened slightly. "Boston, I understand. That's quite a journey." Clara Wilson had no such composure. She gasped audibly, one hand flying to her mouth before she could catch herself. Her eyes darted from Eleanor's scarred face to Thomas, then back again. Confusion and something like horrified fascination etched in her features. "Mrs. Wilson," Eleanor said, extending her hand with the dignity she'd cultivated during 2 years of causing discomfort merely by existing. "How kind of you to call." Clara took her hand reflexively, then seemed to regain her social footing. "Of course, my dear. We're so delighted to have a new neighbor, especially a—" She faltered, clearly searching for an appropriate term. "A teacher," Eleanor supplied calmly. "I taught school in Boston before coming west." "A teacher? How wonderful!" Clara seized on this safe topic. "We've been hoping to establish a proper school in Riverton's Crossing. Currently, Pastor Evans's wife teaches the children 3 days a week in the church, but with more families arriving with the railroad—" "Perhaps you'd all like to come inside," Thomas interrupted. Eleanor was about to prepare the noon meal. Eleanor led the way, acutely aware of the visitors' scrutiny. The kitchen, at least, was tidy, though she hadn't had time to prepare anything for lunch. She busied herself at the stove while Clara settled at the table, her gaze traveling around the room with undisguised curiosity. "You've certainly brought a woman's touch already," she commented, noting the rearranged dishes and the wildflowers Eleanor had placed in a jar that morning. "This place has needed it since Thomas's mother passed." Dr. Grant accepted the cup of coffee Eleanor offered. "How are you finding Wyoming after Boston, Miss Mitchell?" "Very different but beautiful in its own way," Eleanor replied, assembling sandwiches from bread she'd baked that morning. "Mr. Cooper has been kind enough to show me the ranch today." "And you're truly considering staying?" Clara asked, her disbelief poorly concealed. "It's such hard country, especially for someone not raised to it." "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mrs. Wilson," Eleanor said, meeting the woman's gaze directly. "And Mr. Cooper has been honest about the challenges." Clara glanced at Thomas, who stood by the window, his expression closed. Yes, well, Thomas has always been forthright, sometimes to a fault. She leaned forward, lowering her voice as if Thomas couldn't hear her. My dear, you must join us for Sunday services. Everyone will be so eager to meet you. The invitation, well-intentioned as it might be, sent a flutter of anxiety through Eleanor's chest. She knew exactly what everyone would be eager to see. That's very kind of you, she said non-committally. I'm not sure yet what Mr. Cooper's plans are. We don't make it to town much on Sundays, Thomas said from the window. Ranch doesn't observe the Sabbath. Clara tutted disapprovingly. Thomas, Cooper, you can't keep this poor girl isolated out here. She needs female companionship, community. Miss Mitchell makes her own decisions, Thomas replied evenly. And she's here to determine if this life suits her. Dr. Grant cleared his throat. Speaking of which, I hope you won't mind if I ask, Miss Mitchell, how did you come by your injuries? Professional curiosity only. Eleanor stiffened, but kept her voice steady. A schoolhouse fire, Dr. Grant, 2 years ago. The doctor nodded, thoughtfully. You were fortunate to survive with such limited scarring. I've seen many burn victims in my practice who weren't so lucky. The children all survived, Eleanor said quietly. That was the true fortune of the day. You saved them, Clara asked, surprise evident in her voice. Eleanor concentrated on slicing bread. I did what any teacher would do. Not everyone would run back into a burning building, Thomas said, speaking up unexpectedly. Takes courage to face flames. The simple statement, delivered without sentimentality, warmed Eleanor more than any effusive praise could have. She looked up to find Thomas watching her, something like respect in his eyes. Clara looked between them, her expression speculative. Well, it seems you two may understand each other better than anyone might have expected. The meal passed with Clara dominating the conversation, sharing town news and gossip while subtly probing for details about Eleanor's background. Dr. Grant was more circumspect, though his professional interest in Eleanor's scars remained evident in his occasional glances. Thomas said little, answering direct questions but offering nothing more. When the visitors finally departed, with Clara extracting a half-promise that Eleanor would consider attending Sunday services, Thomas and Eleanor stood on the porch, watching the dust from their horses fade in the distance. That's just the beginning, Thomas said grimly. Word will be all over town by supper time. About the scarred bride from Boston, Eleanor asked, a bitter edge to her voice. Thomas glanced at her. Folks here don't have much entertainment. New arrivals are always cause for gossip, and disappointments are cause for even more, Eleanor said, thinking of the stationmaster's face, Matthew's initial rejection, Clara's poorly hidden shock. Will it bother you, Mr. Cooper? The talk? You asking if I'm ashamed to be seen with you? Thomas's directness was startling but strangely refreshing. No, town can gossip all they want. Doesn't change the work that needs doing here. And if I decide to stay, will you be comfortable introducing me as your wife? Thomas turned to face her fully. I lost my pride when I lost this. He held up his scarred hand. Folks stared, talked behind my back, pitied me to my face. But the cattle still needed tending. The fences still needed mending. Earth didn't stop turning because Thomas Cooper got burned. He stepped closer, his gaze steady on her face. I won't lie and say your scars are beautiful, Eleanor. But they tell me something about who you are. Someone who faces fire and doesn't run. Someone who puts others before herself. Those qualities are worth more than smooth skin out here. Eleanor's breath caught at his words. Not poetic, not romantic, but honest in a way that touched something deep within her. Thank you for that, Thomas. He nodded once, then turned back to the yard. Still a lot of daylight left. I need to check the north pasture. You're welcome to join me if you want to see more of the property, or you can rest if the visitors tired you. I'll come, Eleanor said without hesitation. I'd like to see everything. The afternoon passed in a blur of new experiences. Thomas saddled a gentle mare for Eleanor, showing patience as she struggled to remember the riding lessons of her youth. They rode across rolling grassland where cattle grazed in small groups, through stands of pine that offered welcome shade, and finally to a ridge overlooking a winding creek. Creek doesn't dry up even in drought years, Thomas explained as they dismounted to rest the horses. Fed by springs in the mountains, that's what makes this land valuable. Eleanor walked to the edge of the ridge, taking in the vista of water, grass, and distant mountains. The beauty of it caught in her throat. So different from Boston's, crowded streets and grey buildings. "It's magnificent," she said softly. "So open, so alive." Thomas stood beside her, his hat pushed back on his head. Winter's brutal, summer's dusty and hot. Spring's too short and falls when you're racing to prepare before the snow flies. "But it's yours," Eleanor said, understanding instinctively what drove him. "You've built something here." "Trying to," Thomas agreed. "Need it to last, though. Need someone who sees it as more than just land and cattle." The implication hung in the air between them. Eleanor turned to study his profile, the strong jaw, the weathered skin, the eyes that had seen hardship and persevered. Not a handsome man by Boston standards, even before the fire had marked him. But there was something compelling in his directness, his quiet strength. "Is that why you wrote for a bride?" she asked. "To ensure it lasts." Thomas kept his gaze on the horizon, partly also because this place needs children running through it someday, needs laughter and futures to plan for. Otherwise, it's just land that will pass to strangers when I'm gone. The simple honesty of his answer touched Eleanor deeply. In Boston, men spoke of legacies in terms of money and position. Thomas Cooper spoke of children and laughter in a house not yet fully rebuilt. "Do you think we could make that happen?" she asked quietly. "Two scarred people creating something whole?" Thomas finally looked at her, something softening in his eyes. "Don't see why not. Scars just mean we survived something that tried to destroy us. Seems like a good foundation to build on." They rode back as the afternoon light began to mellow, stopping to repair a section of fence where cattle had pushed through. Eleanor watched as Thomas worked, admiring his efficiency despite his injured hand. When he struggled with a particularly stubborn post, she dismounted and held it steady without being asked, earning a surprised but approving nod. The remainder of the day passed in practical tasks, Thomas and Matthew bringing in stray cattle, Eleanor taking inventory of household supplies and beginning to sketch out a garden plot on paper. They ate a simple supper together, the conversation slightly less strained than it had been at breakfast. As twilight deepened, Eleanor sat on the porch steps, a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. The vast Wyoming sky blazed, with more stars than she'd ever seen in Boston, a tapestry of light stretching from horizon to horizon. The immensity of it made her feel small but not insignificant, rather part of something ancient and enduring. Thomas joined her after completing the evening chores, settling on the step beside her with a respectful distance between them. For a while, they simply sat in silence, watching the stars emerge. "First night I came to this land," Thomas said eventually, "I slept under those same stars, nothing but a bedroll and a dream of building something that would last." Eleanor turned to look at him, his profile silvered by starlight. "And now I've got fence posts and cattle and a half-rebuilt house," he said with a slight shrug. "It's a start." "It's more than a start," Eleanor said gently. "It's a home." Thomas glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. "You think so? Even with the work still to be done?" A home isn't about finished walls or fancy furnishings, Eleanor said, thinking of the elegant Boston house where she'd grown up, cold despite its perfection. It's about having a place where you belong, where what you do matters. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. And do you think you could belong here, Eleanor Mitchell? Not just survive, but find something worth staying for? The question held no pressure, just simple curiosity. Eleanor considered it carefully, looking out at the darkened land that stretched to meet the star-filled sky. I think I might, she said honestly. It won't be easy learning everything I need to know, and there will be days when the work seems endless. But yes, I could belong here. Thomas nodded slowly. Good. That's a start. They sat in companionable silence until the chill drove Eleanor inside. As she prepared for bed in her small room, she reflected on how different this day had been from anything she could have imagined in Boston. The work was hard, the comforts few, but there was something profoundly satisfying about it all. The directness of Thomas's speech, the tangible results of labor, the vastness of the land that made her scars seem insignificant by comparison. For the first time since the fire, Eleanor felt the constriction around her heart begin to loosen. Here, in this remote place with this scarred man, perhaps she could be more than the tragedy that had marked her. Perhaps she could be Eleanor Mitchell again, defined by her abilities rather than her limitations. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Eleanor rose early again, finding satisfaction in building up the fire and preparing breakfast before the men appeared. When Thomas entered the kitchen, he paused in the doorway, studying her with an intensity that made her self-conscious. "What is it?" she asked, touching her face automatically. "Nothing," Thomas said, moving to pour coffee. "Just thinking you look at home there." The simple observation warmed her more than it should have. "Thank you. I was thinking of planting herbs by the kitchen window, if you don't object." "It's your kitchen now," Thomas said matter-of-factly. "Or it will be, if you decide to stay." Matthew joined them moments later, his manner noticeably more relaxed than the previous day. "Morning. Eleanor, sleep well?" The casual use of her first name, without the formal Miss Mitchell, was a small but significant shift. Eleanor smiled at him. "Very well, thank you. The air here seems to induce sleep." "Wait until you've been working cattle all day," Matthew said with a grin. "You'll sleep like the dead." They ate quickly, discussing the day's tasks. A section of fence needed repair on the eastern boundary. A heifer was close to calving and needed watching. Seeds had to be ordered for Eleanor's proposed garden. "And we need supplies from town," Thomas added, glancing at Eleanor. "Normally, Matthew makes the trip, but I'd like to go," Eleanor said, surprising herself with her boldness. "If you think it would be appropriate." Thomas studied her face. "Town won't be kind." Staring, whispering. "You sure you want to face that so soon?" Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "If I'm to live here, I can't hide from the nearest town. Better to face it directly." Something like approval flickered in Thomas's eyes. "All right then, we'll go together. Matthew can watch the heifer." 2 hours later, Eleanor sat beside Thomas on the wagon seat, her best dress and bonnet offering small comfort against the knowledge of what awaited them. The ride into Riverton's crossing took nearly an hour, giving her time to appreciate the changing landscape. Rolling grasslands giving way to scattered homesteads, then the clustering of simple buildings that constituted the town. Riverton's crossing wasn't much by Eastern standards, a wide, dusty main street, lined with false-fronted buildings, a church with a modest steeple, a 2-story hotel that had seen better days. But it represented civilization in this remote corner of Wyoming, a place where scattered ranchers and homesteaders could gather for supplies, news, and human connection. Thomas drew the wagon to a halt in front of Wilson's general store. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Eleanor took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Yes, Thomas climbed down, then extended his hand to help her from the wagon. Eleanor placed her fingers in his, noting the strength in his grip, the way he compensated for his scarred left hand without comment or complaint. They stood for a moment facing the store, aware of faces appearing in windows up and down the street. "Quite a welcome committee," Eleanor murmured. The corner of Thomas's mouth twitched. "Told you word travels fast." He offered his arm formally. "Mrs. Wilson will be beside herself." Eleanor placed her hand on his arm, grateful for the solid strength of him beside her. "Then we shouldn't keep her waiting." Together, they walked into the store, heads high, steps measured, neither of them hiding the scars that had brought them together in a way neither could have anticipated. The bell above Wilson's general store announced their arrival with a cheerful jingle that belied the sudden silence that fell. Clara Wilson stood frozen behind the counter, a bolt of calico forgotten in her hands. Three women paused in their conversation by the dry goods, heads turning in unison. A weathered rancher by the seed bins straightened, tipping his hat respectfully, while his eyes widened at the sight of Eleanor's scarred face. Thomas's hand settled at the small of Eleanor's back, a steadying presence as they crossed the threshold. "Mrs. Wilson," he nodded. "Need supplies." Clara recovered quickly, her shopkeepers' smile sliding into place. "Thomas and Miss Mitchell, how lovely to see you in town so soon." She bustled around the counter, lowering her voice as she approached. "I've told everyone about our charming new neighbor. Everyone's simply dying to meet you. I'm sure they are," Eleanor replied with perfect composure, though she felt the weight of every stare like a physical touch. "Mr. Cooper mentioned you carry sewing notions. I find myself in need of thread and needles." "Of course, dear. Right this way." Clara led her toward a display case, speaking in a bright voice clearly meant to carry. "Miss Mitchell taught school in Boston, ladies. Imagine the refinement she brings to our little community." The women exchanged glances, their curiosity palpable. One stepped forward, a plump, pleasant-faced woman with graying hair tucked under a practical bonnet. "Sarah Jenkins, Miss Mitchell. Welcome to Riverton's Crossing." She extended her hand without hesitation, her eyes meeting Eleanor's directly. "My late husband and I settled here 12 years ago. I remember how overwhelming it can be at first." Eleanor took her hand gratefully, recognizing the genuine welcome beneath the words. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. It's a beautiful country, though, quite different from Boston. And you're staying at Whispering Pines with Mr. Cooper." Another woman joined them, her pinched features and elegant dress marking her as someone of importance in the small community. "How unconventional." "Miss Mitchell is considering a position as my wife," Thomas said bluntly, appearing at Eleanor's side with a list in his hand. The statement, delivered in his matter-of-fact manner, sent a ripple of barely suppressed gasps through the store. The woman's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Indeed? I'm Margaret Hayes, Miss Mitchell. My husband is the banker here." She managed a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We must have you both to dinner sometime, once you're settled." Eleanor recognized the dismissal in her tone, the assumption that no such dinner invitation would ever need to be extended. "That would be lovely, Mrs. Hayes. I look forward to becoming better acquainted with everyone." Thomas handed his supply list to Clara. "We'll need these loaded in the wagon, and whatever Miss Mitchell requires." While Clara and her assistant gathered their supplies, Eleanor selected thread, needles, and fabric, aware of the whispered conversations that followed her movement through the store. She kept her head high, her expression serene, though her heart pounded painfully in her chest. She'd endured similar scrutiny in Boston after the fire, but she'd foolishly hoped that here, in this frontier town where life demanded grit rather than beauty, the judgment might be less severe. "Ignore them," Thomas murmured as they examined bolts of sturdy cotton. Half of them have never been east of the Mississippi. They're more afraid of your Boston education than your scars." The unexpected observation startled a genuine laugh from Eleanor. "Is that supposed to be comforting, Mr. Cooper?" The corner of his mouth twitched. "Is it working?" Surprisingly, yes. Eleanor selected a practical blue cotton. 3 yards. "Of this, please, Mrs. Wilson." As Clara measured and cut the fabric, the store door opened again. A tall, elegantly dressed woman entered, followed by a young man whose resemblance to her marked him as her son. The woman paused, her gaze finding Thomas immediately, then shifting to Eleanor with undisguised curiosity. Thomas stiffened beside her. "Caroline," he acknowledged with a curt nod. Eleanor's heart sank. This, then, was the woman who had rejected Thomas after his injury, the banker's daughter who couldn't bear the sight of his scarred hand. She was beautiful in a delicate, refined way, her blonde hair arranged perfectly beneath a fashionable hat, her complexion flawless. "Thomas." Caroline stepped forward, her smile practiced and pleasant. "How wonderful to see you in town. It's been too long." Her gaze shifted to Eleanor, taking in her scarred profile with a slight widening of her eyes. "And you must be Miss Mitchell. Mother mentioned you'd arrived from Boston." "Yes." Eleanor extended her hand, determined to show no weakness. "A pleasure to meet you, Miss." "Mrs. Harrison now," Caroline corrected, accepting Eleanor's hand briefly. "This is my son, James." The young man, perhaps 16, nodded awkwardly, his eyes darting between Thomas and his mother. "Congratulations on your marriage," Thomas said, stiffly. "Thank you." Caroline's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "And I understand congratulations may soon be in order for you as well." Eleanor felt Thomas tense beside her. "If Miss Mitchell finds ranch life to her liking," he said neutrally. Caroline's gaze returned to Eleanor, assessment clear in her expression. "It's a difficult life, Miss Mitchell, especially for someone accustomed to city refinements." Her tone was sympathetic, almost pitying. "Thomas's ranch is rather primitive compared to what you must be used to. I find honest work and straightforward people refreshing after Boston society," Eleanor replied evenly. "And Mr. Cooper has been most welcoming." Something flickered in Caroline's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or grudging respect. "Well, I wish you both happiness." She turned to her son. "James, select the items on your father's list while I speak. With Mrs. Wilson." As Caroline moved away, Eleanor became aware that Thomas was watching her with an odd expression. "What is it?" she asked quietly. "Nothing," he said, then reconsidered. "Most women would have wilted under Caroline Harrison's scrutiny. You stood your ground." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I learned long ago that showing weakness only encourages those looking for it." Thomas nodded slowly. "Another lesson from the fire?" "One of many," Eleanor acknowledged. They completed their purchases with minimal further conversation, both aware of the curious glances and whispered comments that followed them. As Thomas helped load the supplies into the wagon, Eleanor felt a tug at her skirt. She turned to find a small girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, looking up at her with solemn eyes. "Does your face hurt, lady?" the child asked, her voice carrying. In the sudden hush that fell over the boardwalk, a woman hurried forward, mortification written across her features. "Lily! That's not polite. I'm so sorry, Miss Mitchell." Eleanor crouched to the child's level, careful to turn so her scarred profile was fully visible. "Not anymore," she said gently. "It hurt very much when it happened, but it's all healed now." The little girl nodded seriously. "My brother burned his hand on the stove. He cried a lot." "I cried too," Eleanor confided, her voice soft. "Being burned hurts terribly. You're still pretty," the child declared with the absolute conviction of the very young. "Your eyes are nice. Unexpected tears prickled behind Eleanor's eyes. "Thank you, Lily. That's very kind of you to say." The mother, her face crimson with embarrassment, tugged the child away with another stammered apology. Eleanor rose, composing herself, to find Thomas watching her with an unreadable expression. "Ready to head back?" he asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, suddenly eager to leave the curious stares and whispered comments behind. Thomas helped her onto the wagon seat, his hand strong and steady beneath her elbow. As they pulled away from the storefront, Eleanor caught a glimpse of Caroline Harrison watching them from the doorway, her expression thoughtful. They rode in silence for several minutes, the town falling away behind them. Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders slowly relaxing as the open country spread before them. "You handled that well," Thomas said finally. "Better than I did my first time back in town after the fire." Eleanor glanced at him. "What happened?" Thomas's mouth twisted. "Broke Jim Wilson's nose when he asked if I could still use a gun with my crippled hand. Proved I could, right before I knocked him down." The blunt admission startled a laugh from Eleanor. "I can't imagine you brawling in the street." "I was angry back then," Thomas admitted. "Angry at the fire, at Caroline for leaving, at God for letting it happen." He glanced at his scarred hand on the reins. "Took time to realize anger doesn't rebuild what's been burned." "No," Eleanor agreed softly. "It doesn't." They rode in, companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic creaking of the wagon strangely soothing. The vast Wyoming sky stretched above them, scattered clouds casting moving shadows across the grassland. "The little girl was right, you know," Thomas said unexpectedly. "Your eyes are nice." The simple compliment, delivered in his matter-of-fact way, warmed Eleanor more than flowery poetry might have. "Thank you. Caroline was beautiful," Thomas continued, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Everyone said so. But when I came back from the doctor with these scars, all I saw in her eyes was horror and pity." He glanced briefly at Eleanor. "Never saw either in yours, not even when Matthew first brought you to the ranch." "We recognize our own," Eleanor said quietly. "The fire marks us in ways others can't understand." Thomas nodded slowly. "Reckon that's true." When they returned to Whispering Pines, Matthew was waiting with news that the heifer had delivered a healthy calf. Thomas immediately went to check on the new arrival, leaving Eleanor to unpack their purchases. She worked efficiently, storing food supplies, organizing sewing materials, and planning how the new fabric might best be used to patch the worn curtains in the main room. The simple domestic tasks soothed her after the tension of town. Here, within the boundaries of Whispering Pines, she didn't need to brace herself for stares or whispers. Even Matthew now looked at her directly when they spoke, his initial discomfort seemingly forgotten. The remainder of the day passed in ordinary chores, cooking, cleaning, helping Thomas sort through years of accumulated papers in his mother's old desk. They worked well together, Eleanor thought, anticipating each other's needs with minimal conversation. By evening, the house felt subtly different, more organized, more welcoming. After supper, Thomas surprised her by asking if she could help with the account books. "Never had much schooling," he admitted, spreading ledgers across the kitchen table. "Matthew's even worse with figures. Been guessing more than calculating these past years." Eleanor examined the haphazard records with a teacher's critical eye. "These need significant work," she said honestly, "but I can set up a proper accounting system for you." "For us," Thomas corrected quietly, "if you decide to stay." Their eyes met across the table, the implication hanging between them. Eleanor nodded slowly. "For us, then." They worked late into the evening, Eleanor bringing order to years of chaotic bookkeeping while Thomas explained the seasonal patterns of ranch income and expenses. It was well past midnight when they finally stopped, both tired but satisfied with the progress made. "Thank you," Thomas said as they stacked the ledgers. "Been needing that done for years." "You're welcome," Eleanor replied, stifling a yawn. "Tomorrow I can show you how to maintain the system going forward." Thomas studied her face in the lamplight. "You're tired. I've kept you up too late." "I don't mind," Eleanor said honestly. "It feels good to be useful again." Something softened in Thomas's expression. "You're more than useful, Eleanor. You belong here." The simple statement, delivered without flourish or sentimentality, touched her deeply. "I'm beginning to think so too." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. Eleanor rose each morning before dawn, prepared breakfast for the men, then turned her attention to the house. The floors were scrubbed until they gleamed, windows washed to let in more light, furniture polished and rearranged. In the afternoons, she often joined Thomas in checking fence lines or moving cattle, learning the boundaries of the ranch and the basics of animal husbandry. To her surprise, she found she enjoyed the physical work. There was satisfaction in seeing immediate results from her labor. A fence mended, a garden plot cleared, bread rising in the kitchen. At night, she fell into exhausted sleep, her body aching, but her mind clearer than it had been in years. On the fourth day after their trip to town, Eleanor was hanging freshly washed curtains when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. Looking out, she saw Sarah Jenkins, the widow she'd met at the general store, dismounting from a sturdy pony. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion," Sarah called, spotting Eleanor at the window. "Thought you might appreciate some female company." Eleanor hurried to the door, surprised but pleased by the unexpected visit. "Mrs. Jenkins, welcome to Whispering Pines." "Sarah, please," the older woman said, removing her gloves. "Mrs. Jenkins makes me feel like my mother-in-law." She handed Eleanor a cloth-covered basket, brought some preserves and a few garden starts. "Thought you might be planning a kitchen garden." "How thoughtful," Eleanor said sincerely, leading her visitor inside. "I was just making tea. Would you join me?" Sarah settled at the kitchen table, her keen gaze taking in the changes Eleanor had made to the house. "You've worked wonders in just a few days," she observed. "This place hasn't felt like a home since Thomas's mother passed." Eleanor poured tea into cups she'd found at the back of a cupboard and polished to a shine. "It's a good house. It just needed some attention. And a woman's touch," Sarah added, accepting the tea gratefully. "Thomas is a good man, but housekeeping isn't his strength." "No," Eleanor agreed with a small smile, "but he's straightforward and honest. I appreciate that." After Boston society, Sarah studied her over the rim of her cup. "May I speak frankly, my dear?" "Please do." "There's been talk in town since your arrival. Speculation about why Thomas would bring a, forgive me, scarred woman from the East as his bride." Sarah's expression was kind but serious. "Some suggest desperation on both your parts." Eleanor sat very still, absorbing the direct words without flinching. "And what do you think, Sarah?" "I think you're both survivors," the older woman said simply. "And survivors recognize each other." She set down her cup. "My husband and I came west when there was nothing here but Indians and buffalo. Lost 2 children to fever that first winter. Nearly lost everything in the blizzard of '64. Her eyes held Eleanor's steadily. "Scars aren't always visible, my dear, but we all carry them. What matters is finding someone who doesn't flinch from looking at them." Eleanor's throat tightened unexpectedly. "Thomas doesn't flinch." "No," Sarah agreed. "He wouldn't." She reached across the table to pat Eleanor's hand. "That's why I'm here. To tell you that not everyone in town shares Margaret Hayes's narrow vision or Caroline Harrison's delicate sensibilities." "I appreciate that more than I can say," Eleanor admitted. Sarah smiled warmly. "Now, tell me about your garden plans. These rocky soils need special handling if you want anything more substantial than weeds." They spent a pleasant hour discussing practical matters. which vegetables thrived in Wyoming's short-growing season, how to preserve food for winter, where to find the best milk cow when funds allowed. Sarah's advice was practical and freely given, without the condescension Eleanor had feared. When Thomas returned from checking the north pasture, he seemed surprised but not displeased to find Sarah Jenkins at his kitchen table. "Mrs. Jenkins," he greeted her with a respectful nod. "Good to see you." "Your Eleanor and I have been getting acquainted," Sarah replied, rising to take her leave. "She'll make a fine rancher's wife, Thomas. Don't let the town gossips convince either of you otherwise." After Sarah departed, Thomas helped Eleanor plant the garden starts, hardy herbs and early vegetables that might survive even if late. Frost came. They worked side by side in the freshly turned soil, their hands occasionally brushing, a comfortable silence between them. "Mrs. Jenkins seems to have decided I'm staying," Eleanor observed as they packed soil around a rosemary plant. Thomas glanced at her, something like hope in his eyes. "Are you staying?" Eleanor looked around at the ranch. The house, with its partly rebuilt west wing, the barn weathered but sound, the rolling land stretching toward distant mountains. In just days, it had begun to feel like home in a way Boston never had after the fire. "Yes," she said simply, "if you still want me to." Thomas straightened, wiping soil from his good hand. "I do." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Not just for the ranch, for me." The admission, clearly difficult for him, touched Eleanor deeply. "Then I'll stay." Thomas nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Should ride into town tomorrow, see the preacher." "So soon?" Eleanor asked, surprised by his directness. "Unless you need more time," Thomas amended, "but there's no sense waiting if we've decided." Eleanor considered this practical approach to marriage, so different from the romantic notions she'd been raised with in Boston, yet there was something refreshingly honest about it. No flowery declarations, no empty promises, just two people choosing to build a life together, scarred but unbowed. "Tomorrow then," she agreed, "though people will talk all the more." Thomas shrugged. "Let them. We've work to do here that won't wait on gossip." That evening, after Matthew had retired to his quarters in the barn, Thomas and Eleanor sat on the porch steps watching darkness settle over the land. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. "There's something I should tell you," Thomas said after a long silence. "About the fire." "About what happened?" Eleanor turned to look at him, his profile strong against the fading light. "You don't have to explain your scars to me, Thomas." "Not explaining, just..." He flexed his damaged hand. "Just want you to know the whole truth before tomorrow." Eleanor nodded, understanding his need. "I'm listening." Thomas took a deep breath. "Storm came up sudden. Lightning hit the stable while I was checking on a sick colt. Fire caught fast in the hay. Got most of the horses out, but my stallion, best horse I ever bred, was trapped in the back stall." He stared out at the darkening land, his voice low but steady. "Went back in for him. Roof was already burning. Caroline was screaming at me to leave him. But that horse was worth more than just money. He was the beginning of building something better here." Eleanor could picture it vividly. The terror of the trapped animal, Thomas's determination, the roaring flames. "You saved him." "Almost didn't. Beam fell, trapped my arm. Horse panicked, reared up." Thomas's expression tightened at the memory. "Should have died there. Would have, if Matthew hadn't come looking. He pulled me out, went back for the horse. Himself." "That's why he stays," Eleanor realized. "Not just employment." Thomas nodded. "We were in the war together. Saved each other more than once." He paused, then continued. "Doctor wanted to take the hand. Said it was too damaged, but I wouldn't let him. Knew a one-handed rancher wouldn't last a season out here." "It must have been excruciating," Eleanor said softly, thinking of her own healing process. The endless pain as burned skin slowly regenerated. Was, Thomas acknowledged. Still is, sometimes, when the weather changes. He looked down at his scarred hand. But it works. Not pretty, but functional, like this ranch. Like us, Eleanor added quietly. Thomas looked up, his gaze meeting hers. Yes, like us. He hesitated, then asked, "Your turn. The schoolhouse." Eleanor had known this moment would come, had prepared for it, yet still found her heart beating faster at the prospect of sharing the full story. It was an ordinary day, spring. The children were restless, watching the clock, waiting for dismissal bell. She folded her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. The coal stove in the corner had been temperamental all winter. I'd reported it several times, but repairs in Boston's poorer districts weren't a priority. Her voice grew distant with memory. A girl was reciting her arithmetic when I smelled the smoke. The stovepipe had collapsed, sending embers onto the wooden floor. Thomas listened silently, his expression grave. We had 38 children that day, ages 6 to 12. The fire spread so quickly, those old wooden buildings, decades of polish on the floors. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, seeing it all again. We got most of them out immediately, but 3 of the younger ones panicked, hid under desks in the back of the room. You went back for them, Thomas said. Not a question. Eleanor nodded. Found 2 quickly. The 3rd, little Joseph Abernathy, had crawled into a supply cupboard. Her fingers rose unconsciously to trace the ridged skin of her cheek. The ceiling beam fell just as I carried him out. Caught me here. She touched her face. And here. Her hand moved to her right shoulder and arm, where the scars continued beneath her dress. The children? They all survived? Yes. That at least had been her consolation through everything that followed. Not a single child lost. But afterward, she paused, gathering herself. Afterward, the school board decided my appearance would frighten the children. Parents agreed. No one wanted their children taught by a woman who reminded them of danger, of mortality. Fools, Thomas said quietly, the single word carrying more understanding than all the platitudes she'd heard. In Boston, perhaps, Eleanor said with a small shrug, but I couldn't find another position. My parents had died years before. My small savings dwindled. Eventually, Mrs. Barnes's advertisement in the Boston paper seemed like providence, a chance to go somewhere new, to be judged by something other than my scars. Ah, now you're here, Thomas said, his gaze steady on her face. Now I'm here, Eleanor agreed, about to marry a man I've known less than a week. Thomas's mouth quirked in a rare, almost smile. When you put it that way, it does sound foolish. Does it? Eleanor challenged gently. Or is it simply practical? 2 people who understand each other's wounds, building something together. Still, Thomas said, suddenly looking uncertain in a way that touched her. You deserve better than just practical. Boston ladies expect romance, don't they? Eleanor laughed softly. Boston ladies expect many things I can no longer provide. Beauty, social connections, family wealth. But you've offered me honesty and purpose. That's worth more than flowers and poetry, Thomas. He studied her face in the gathering darkness. You're sure? About tomorrow? I'm sure, Eleanor said, simply. Thomas nodded once, decision made. Then we should turn in, early start tomorrow. They rose together, pausing at the doorway. For a moment, Eleanor thought Thomas might reach for her, might bridge the careful distance they'd maintained. Instead, he simply held the door, his expression softening as she passed him. Good night, Eleanor. Good night, Thomas. In her small bedroom, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the simple dress she'd laid out for tomorrow. Not a wedding gown by any means, just her best blue dress, slightly faded but well made. It would serve the purpose, just as she would serve as Thomas Cooper's wife. Not the romance she'd dreamed of as a girl, perhaps, but something possibly more enduring, a partnership built on mutual need and growing respect. Outside her window, the vast Wyoming sky blazed with stars. Eleanor watched them until her eyes grew heavy, thinking of fires that destroyed and remade, of scars that marked but did not define, and of a scarred rancher who looked at her damaged face and saw not what was lost, but what remained. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and cool, the first hint of spring softening the Wyoming landscape. Eleanor stood at her bedroom window, watching the sun crest the distant hills, casting long shadows across the land that would now truly be her home. She dressed with careful deliberation, smoothing the fabric of her blue dress, pinning her hair in a simple but elegant style that minimized her scars without appearing to hide them. A soft knock at her door announced Sarah Jenkins, who had arrived early to help with preparations. "You look lovely, my dear," the older woman said, entering with a small bouquet of early wildflowers and sage. "Thomas is pacing the barn like a caged mountain lion." Eleanor smiled, accepting the makeshift bouquet. "Nervous?" "Terrified, I'd say," Sarah chuckled, "which is a good sign. Means this matters to him." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a slender silver chain with a small pearl pendant. "This was my mother's, something borrowed for today." Unexpected tears pricked Eleanor's eyes as Sarah fastened the necklace around her throat. Such a small, feminine gesture of friendship, yet it meant more than elaborate wedding presents might have in Boston. "Thank you," she whispered. "Now," Sarah said briskly, wiping away a tear of her own, "let's not keep that man waiting any longer. Poor Matthew's about worn a path in the barn floor, trying to keep him occupied." The journey to town passed in a blur of anticipation and nerves. Thomas sat beside Eleanor on the wagon seat, freshly shaven, wearing a clean shirt and his best pants, the scars on his left hand partially hidden by a new glove. He'd said little that morning beyond asking if she was certain, his eyes searching her face for any sign of doubt or regret. "I'm certain," she'd told him simply, and the tension in his shoulders had eased just a little. Riverton's crossing looked different today, less intimidating than it had during their shopping trip. Perhaps it was the bright spring sunshine, or perhaps it was the knowledge that after today, she would return to town as Mrs. Thomas Cooper, a woman with a place and purpose in this community, not an object of pity and speculation. They had agreed on a simple ceremony, just the two of them, Matthew as witness and Pastor Evans officiating. No elaborate celebration, no wedding breakfast, nothing to draw additional attention. Yet as Thomas helped Eleanor down from the wagon, in front of the small white church, she was startled to see several horses and buggies already gathered. "What's this?" Thomas murmured, his expression darkening. The church door opened and Sarah Jenkins emerged, looking pleased with herself. "Thought you two might slip in and out without anyone noticing, did you? That's not how we do things in Riverton's Crossing." Behind her stood Dr. Grant, his wife, the postmistress Mrs. Barnes, and several ranchers Thomas had nodded to during their previous visit to town. Even Clara Wilson was there, her husband Robert beside her, though Eleanor noted the absence of Margaret Hayes and Caroline Harrison. "We don't need an audience," Thomas said stiffly. Sarah's expression softened. "It's not an audience, Thomas. It's neighbors welcoming a new family. That's how we survive out here, together." She turned to Eleanor. "But if you'd prefer privacy, say the word, and we'll clear them all out." Eleanor glanced at Thomas, saw the uncertainty in his eyes, and made a decision. "No," she said, taking his arm firmly. "Sarah's right. We're building a life here. These people are part of it." She smiled up at him. "Besides, I've never been one to hide." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, pride perhaps, or admiration. He covered her hand with his scarred one. "All right then." The small church was simply decorated with spring wildflowers and ribbons. Pastor Evans, a kind-faced man with iron grey hair, met them at the altar with a welcoming smile that didn't falter when he saw Eleanor's scarred face. The ceremony itself was brief and unadorned. No elaborate vows, no lengthy sermon, just the ancient promises exchanged in clear, steady voices. I, Eleanor Mitchell, take thee, Thomas Cooper. I, Thomas Cooper, take thee, Eleanor Mitchell. When Pastor Evans pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas hesitated only a moment before leaning down to place a gentle, almost hesitant kiss on Eleanor's lips, their first. It was brief, proper, yet Eleanor felt something quicken inside. Her at the contact, a flutter of possibility that went beyond their practical arrangement. They turned to face the small congregation as husband and wife, Eleanor's hand resting on Thomas's arm, his scarred left hand covering hers in a gesture that felt both protective and seeking protection. The assembled neighbors broke into genuine applause. Sarah Jenkins wiping away tears, Matthew grinning broadly from the front pew. "Mrs. Cooper," Thomas said quietly, testing the name as they walked back down the short aisle. "Mr. Cooper," Eleanor replied with a small smile, surprised by how right it felt. Outside the church, they found themselves surrounded by well-wishers. Dr. Grant pumped Thomas's hand enthusiastically, while his wife pressed a small package into Eleanor's hands. "Medicinal herbs from my garden," she explained, "for teas and poultices. The winters are hard on newcomers." Clara Wilson embraced Eleanor with unexpected warmth. "I've put together a basket with some essentials," she said, nodding toward a hamper being loaded into their wagon by her husband. "Just a few things to get your pantry properly stocked." Even the stationmaster, who had first rejected Eleanor at the train station, approached, hat in hand, his expression sheepish. "Mrs. Cooper," he nodded respectfully. "Wanted to apologize for not being neighborly when you arrived. Wyoming needs good women as much as it needs strong men." Eleanor accepted the apology with grace, aware of Thomas's proud stance beside her. One by one, the townspeople welcomed her, offering small gifts, advice about the coming seasons, invitations to social gatherings. Not everyone was present. The banker's family and several of the town's more prominent citizens were noticeably absent, but those who had come showed genuine goodwill. As they prepared to depart, Sarah Jenkins pulled Eleanor aside for a final embrace. "Remember, my dear, marriage isn't just about working side by side. It's about seeing each other in the dark, too." Eleanor understood her meaning all too well. Until now, she and Thomas had maintained a respectful distance, their connection built on common purpose and mutual respect rather than physical intimacy. Tonight, that would change. The wagon ride home was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. Thomas handled the reins competently with his scarred hand, occasionally glancing at Eleanor as if reassuring himself she was still there, still content with her choice. "Surprised me?" he said finally as Whispering Pines came into view. "All those people." "Me too," Eleanor admitted. "I didn't expect such acceptance." "Not complete acceptance," Thomas noted. "Banker Hayes wasn't there. Neither was Caroline or her husband." "No," Eleanor agreed, "but enough people were. We have allies in town, Thomas. That's more than I had. In Boston after the fire," he nodded slowly. "Sarah Jenkins is a good friend to have. Her husband was respected before he passed. She still carries that influence." They pulled into the yard as the afternoon light began to mellow. Matthew had ridden ahead and now emerged from the barn with a broad smile. "Got everything ready," he announced, helping Eleanor down from the wagon. "Stew's warming, bread's baking, and I'll be bunking in the line shack tonight. Give you two some privacy." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication. Thomas cleared his throat, looking almost as uncomfortable. "That's not necessary, Matthew." "Course it is," the ranch hand replied cheerfully. "Man and wife." Deserve a proper wedding night. He winked at Eleanor, then turned serious. I'm happy for you both, real happy. After Matthew departed, whistling as he rode toward the distant line shack, an awkward silence fell between them. They stood in the yard, suddenly strangers despite the gold band now adorning Eleanor's finger. Should get the horses settled, Thomas said finally. I'll start supper, Eleanor replied, grateful for the familiar routine. They separated to their tasks, the normalcy of chores easing some of the tension. By the time Thomas entered the kitchen, stamping mud from his boots, Eleanor had the table set and a meal prepared from Clara's generous basket. Smells good, Thomas said, washing his hands at the basin. They ate quietly, the absence of Matthew's usual chatter conspicuous. Eleanor found herself noticing details about Thomas she hadn't fully registered before. The precise way he cut his food, the slight furrow between his brows when he concentrated, the careful way he handled his injured hand when he thought no one was watching. Got you something, Thomas said abruptly as they finished the meal. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box, sliding it across the table with uncharacteristic hesitation. Eleanor opened it to find a simple gold band, well crafted but unadorned. When did you... Asked Matthew to pick it up last time he was in town, Thomas explained, his ears reddening slightly. Should have given it to you at the ceremony, but... He shrugged. Wasn't sure you'd go through with it until you said, I do. The simple honesty of the admission touched Eleanor deeply. She removed the ring from its box and held it out to him. Would you? Thomas took the ring in his good hand, then gently lifted her left hand. His fingers were rough with calluses, but surprisingly gentle as he slid the band onto her finger, a perfect match to the one Pastor Evans had given her during the ceremony. Thank you, she said softly. It's beautiful. Nothing fancy, Thomas said, looking uncomfortable with the moment's intimacy, but solid, like us. Like us. The words echoed in Eleanor's mind as they cleared the table together, moving around, each other in the kitchen with growing ease. They had built a partnership based on practicality and mutual need, but something else was growing between them. Something unplanned and delicate, like the first green shoots pushing through Wyoming's rocky soil after winter. Night fell early. The familiar routines of securing the house for darkness completed in companionable silence. When the last lamp was lit, the last door checked, they stood in the main room facing each other, the moment they'd both been anticipating, and perhaps dreading finally upon them. I'll bank the fire, Thomas said, his voice carefully neutral. Eleanor nodded. I'll prepare for bed. In her room, their room now, Eleanor changed into her nightgown with trembling fingers. She'd known this moment would come when she agreed to be Thomas's wife, had prepared herself for it as a duty to be fulfilled, a necessary part of their arrangement. Yet now, faced with the reality, she found herself afraid, not of Thomas, whom she trusted implicitly, but of her own vulnerability. Since the fire, she had allowed no one to see her fully. The scars extended beyond her face, tracking across her right shoulder and down her arm, a permanent map of that terrible day. Would Thomas recoil from the full extent of her disfigurement? Would the practical arrangement they'd made falter in the face of physical intimacy? A soft knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Eleanor, may I come in? She took a deep breath, wrapping her dressing gown more tightly around herself. Yes. Thomas entered hesitantly, already changed into a clean nightshirt and pants. His hair was damp from washing, his feet bare, making him look somehow younger and more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. I can sleep in the other room, he said without preamble, if you prefer. The unexpected offer loosened something tight in Eleanor's chest. This is your room, Thomas. Your house. Our house, he corrected gently. Our room, if you want it to be. He remained by the door, giving her space. I meant what I said before the wedding, Eleanor. No false promises. That includes this. I won't ask for anything you're not ready to give. Eleanor studied him in the lamplight, this scarred, straightforward man who had already shown more consideration for her feelings than many so-called gentlemen in Boston. I am your wife, she said quietly, in all ways. Being my wife doesn't mean you owe me your body tonight, Thomas replied with unexpected eloquence. We have time, Eleanor. Time to know each other, to build something real. He looked down at his scarred hand. I know what it's like to have people stare at your wounds, to feel ashamed of your own skin. I won't add to that burden. Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes at his perception, his simple kindness. I'm afraid, she admitted softly, not of you, of what you'll see. Understanding dawned in Thomas's eyes. The fire marked you elsewhere. Eleanor nodded, one hand unconsciously moving to her right shoulder where the worst of the scarring began. Yes. Thomas took a single step closer, then stopped, respecting her space. Eleanor, look at me. She raised her eyes to his, saw nothing but gentle understanding in his weathered face. I build fences with a hand that most men would consider useless, he said simply. I break horses, brand cattle, and run this ranch with scars that made my own fiancée turn away in revulsion. Do you really think I'd see your scars any differently than I see my own? The truth of it washed over Eleanor like a cleansing rain. Of course, of all men, Thomas Cooper would understand, would see beyond damaged flesh to the person beneath. No, she whispered. I don't think you would. Thomas's expression softened. Come here. She moved toward him slowly, stopping just within arm's reach. With deliberate care, Thomas extended his scarred left hand, palm up, an offering and a question. Eleanor placed her right hand in his, allowing the sleeve of her dressing gown to fall back, revealing the beginning of the burn scars that traced down her arm. Thomas looked at their joined hands, damaged flesh touching damaged flesh, then gently raised her scarred knuckles to his lips. Perfect, he murmured against her skin. The simple word, the gentleness of the gesture, broke something open inside Eleanor. Tears spilled down her cheeks as Thomas drew her carefully into his arms, his embrace protective but undemanding. We'll go slow, he promised, his breath warm against her hair. As slow as you need, and if all we do tonight is sleep side by side, that's enough. That's a beginning. A beginning, Eleanor echoed, allowing herself to lean into his strength, to believe that this scarred man might truly see beauty where others had seen only damage. They did sleep side by side that night, Thomas keeping a respectful distance. Even as his presence brought unexpected comfort, Eleanor woke once in the darkness to find him watching her, his expression soft in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. Bad dream? He asked quietly. No, she replied, surprised to realize. It was true. For the first time in many nights, the fire hadn't haunted her sleep, just adjusting. Thomas nodded in understanding. It's strange, having someone else here after so long alone. Strange, Eleanor agreed, but not unwelcome. A small smile touched his lips. No, not unwelcome at all. They drifted back to sleep, a fraction closer than before, and when dawn broke across the Wyoming sky, Eleanor woke to find her hand resting trustingly in his. The days that followed established a new rhythm to life at Whispering Pines. They worked side by side from sunup to sundown, Eleanor taking on the household responsibilities while learning the rudiments of ranch management, Thomas teaching her about cattle, horses, and the land's seasonal demands. Matthew returned from the line shack with tactful discretion, resuming his place in the daily routine without comment on the new sleeping arrangements. By day, they were partners in the truest sense, anticipating each other's needs, developing the wordless communication of people accustomed to working together. By night, they began the delicate dance of becoming truly husband and wife, moving at Eleanor's pace, Thomas never pushing, but always steady, always patient. A week after the wedding, Dr. Grant rode out to check on them, his visit ostensibly professional, but clearly fueled by community curiosity. He found them mending fence together, Eleanor holding posts steady, while Thomas secured the wire with his good hand. "Married life seems to agree with you both," the doctor observed, accepting the cup of water Eleanor offered. "You're looking well, Mrs. Cooper." "Thank you, Dr. Grant," Eleanor replied, noting with quiet pride that he met her gaze directly now, no longer allowing his eyes to skitter away from her scars. "We're keeping busy. I can see that." The doctor turned to Thomas. "Your hand giving you any trouble with all this work?" Thomas flexed his scarred fingers. "No more than usual. Eleanor's been making a salve that helps with the stiffness." "Has she now?" Dr. Grant looked intrigued. "What sort of salve?" Eleanor described the mixture of herbs and rendered fat she'd learned from her grandmother, a remedy for burns and scarring that she'd adapted for her own use after the fire. The doctor listened with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions about proportions and application. "I'd like to try some on other patients," he said when she'd finished, "if you'd be willing to make extra." The request, so normal, so respectful of her knowledge, warmed Eleanor deeply. "Of course, I'd be happy to." After the doctor departed, Thomas gave her a long look. "You didn't tell me you were skilled with medicines." Eleanor shrugged slightly. "It didn't seem important, just something I learned out of necessity after—" She gestured toward her face. "It's important," Thomas said firmly. "Everything you bring to this ranch is important, Eleanor." The simple statement, delivered in his matter-of-fact way, meant more than elaborate compliments might have. Eleanor felt herself blushing, unused to such direct appreciation. "Thank you." Thomas nodded, once then turned back to the fence. But as they worked, Eleanor caught him watching her with something new in his eyes, not just respect for her abilities, but a deeper appreciation of her as a person with knowledge and gifts beyond what he'd initially recognized. The next test of their fledgling partnership came unexpectedly, 3 weeks after their wedding. Eleanor was in the kitchen, preserving early spring vegetables from her newly established garden, when Matthew burst through the door, his face pale with urgency. "Where's Thomas?" he demanded without preamble. "Checking the creek pasture," Eleanor replied, instantly alert. "What's happened?" "Fire," Matthew said grimly. "Lightning struck the Johnson place. They're calling for all hands. It's moving fast toward the East Ridge." Fire. The word alone sent ice through Eleanor's veins, memories of screaming children and falling timbers flashing through her mind, but she pushed the fear aside, focusing on practical action. "I'll saddle Penny. We'll head out together." Matthew hesitated. "Eleanor, maybe you should stay here. Fire's dangerous, and with your history—" "I'll saddle Penny," Eleanor repeated firmly. "My history is precisely why I won't sit safely at home while others fight flames. What supplies should we bring?" Matthew recognized the steel beneath her calm exterior and nodded once. "Blankets, buckets if you have them, and water. All we can carry." By the time Thomas rode hard into the yard, Eleanor had the supplies loaded onto a pack. Horse and Penny saddled, wearing the split riding skirt she'd fashioned from an old pair of Thomas's trousers. "Eleanor," Thomas began, his expression darkening when he saw her preparations. "I'm coming," she said simply, meeting his eyes with quiet determination. "I know fire, Thomas. I know what it can do. and I know how to fight it." Thomas opened, his mouth as if to argue, then closed it, studying her resolute stance. "Stay with me," he said finally. "No heroics. Promise me." "I promise," Eleanor agreed, relief flooding her that he didn't intend to waste precious time arguing. They rode hard toward the column of smoke rising ominously on the eastern horizon. As they crested a ridge, the full scope of the disaster came into view, a wall of flame devouring dry grass and underbrush, driven by spring winds toward the dense pine forest that separated the Johnson homestead from whispering pines. Half a dozen men already fought the blaze, using wet blankets and hastily dug fire breaks to try to contain its spread. Thomas assessed the situation with a rancher's experienced eye. "Wind's pushing it toward the creek. If we can hold it there, the water might stop it." He turned to Matthew. "Ride to the south edge. Tell Sam Willis we need men digging a firebreak along the creek bed." To Eleanor, he added, "Stay close. We'll work the north edge. Try to keep it from jumping the ridge." Eleanor nodded, throat tight with remembered fear but mind clear. They rode toward the north flank of the fire, the heat intensifying as they approached, smoke stinging their eyes and lungs. Thomas dismounted, tying the horses securely to a tree well away from the flames, then handed Eleanor a wet blanket from their supplies. "Beat out any sparks that cross the ridge," he instructed. "Don't get too close to the main fire. Your job is to catch the strays before they take hold." For hours they worked in grim silence, beating out embers, clearing brush to create a fire break. Eleanor focusing on the smaller spot fires, while Thomas and other men tackled the main blaze. The smoke was suffocating, the heat intense, sweat soaking through their clothes, despite the cool spring air. Eleanor lost track of time, aware only of the rhythmic swing of her blanket, the sting of smoke in her lungs, the constant vigilance required to spot new ignitions before they could grow. She ignored the trembling in her limbs, the fear that threatened to paralyze her whenever the flames roared higher. This was not Boston. She was not alone, and these flames would not claim another piece of her life. She was stamping out a small fire that had jumped the firebreak when a sudden shift in the wind sent a wall of smoke and embers toward her. Momentarily blinded, Eleanor stumbled backward, tripped over a fallen branch, and went down hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. As she struggled to rise, disoriented by smoke and the fall, a burning branch crashed down nearby, sending up a shower of sparks that settled on the dry grass around her. "Eleanor!" Thomas's voice cut through the roar of the flames, distant but urgent. She tried to call back, but smoke filled her lungs, sending her into a spasm of coughing. The small fires around her were growing, cutting off her retreat back to the ridge. For a terrifying moment, Eleanor was back in the Boston schoolhouse. Flames closing in, children screaming, "No way out!" Then a figure burst through the smoke, Thomas's familiar outline blurred by heat and ash. Without hesitation, he grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet and away from the encroaching flames. His left hand, the scarred one, beat out burning embers. On her skirt with bare fingers, heedless of his own pain. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, eyes searching her face, hands running over her arms and shoulders, checking for injuries. "No," Eleanor managed between coughs, "just fell." Relief washed over Thomas's smoke-blackened face, followed immediately by anger. "I told you to stay close. You could have been killed." Before Eleanor could respond, a shout went up from further down the ridge. "It's jumping the creek! Everyone to the south side!" Thomas's attention snapped back to the larger crisis. "Can you ride?" Eleanor nodded, forcing steadiness into her limbs. "Yes, I'm fine." The battle continued as they joined the other ranchers at the creek, forming a desperate line against the advance of the flames. By nightfall, exhaustion had settled into every muscle, but the fire was finally contained, its spread halted by the combined efforts of every available hand within riding distance. The Johnson homestead had been saved, though their barn and several outbuildings were lost. As families began the weary journey home, promises of help with rebuilding were exchanged. Neighbors supporting neighbors in the way of frontier communities. Thomas, Eleanor, and Matthew rode back to Whispering Pines in exhausted silence, the smell of smoke clinging to their clothes and hair, soot streaking their faces. Eleanor swayed slightly in the saddle, fatigue and the aftermath of fear catching up with her. Without comment, Thomas maneuvered his horse alongside hers, one hand steadying her when she might have slipped. At the ranch, Matthew took charge of the horses while Thomas helped Eleanor into the house. Her legs nearly buckled as she crossed the threshold, the adrenaline that had sustained her finally ebbing away. Thomas caught her before she could fall, lifting her easily in his arms and carrying her to their bedroom. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "I know," Thomas replied, his voice rough with fatigue and something else, concern perhaps, or lingering fear. "Let me do this, Eleanor." He set her gently on the bed, then knelt to remove her boots. Eleanor watched him through half-closed eyes, noting the careful way he examined her ankles for signs of injury, the gentleness of hands that had fought fire and built fences, and now tended to her with such care. "You need to wash," he said, rising to fetch the basin and pitcher. "Smoke gets into everything." Eleanor nodded, too exhausted to argue. Thomas poured warm water into the basin and handed her a cloth, then turned to give her privacy. "I'll check. And Matthew, make sure he's seeing to himself as well." Before he could leave, Eleanor caught his wrist. "Thomas, thank you for coming back for me." He looked down at her, something fierce and protective in his gaze. "I'll always come back for you, Eleanor. You're my wife." The simple declaration, spoken with such certainty, washed over her like a benediction. "And you're my husband," she replied softly, "in all ways." Understanding dawned in Thomas's eyes, understanding of what she was offering, what threshold they were crossing. He hesitated, searching her face. "You're exhausted and frightened. This isn't the time for—" "It's exactly the time," Eleanor interrupted gently. "I faced fire today, Thomas. Again. And this time, I wasn't alone." She rose from the bed, standing before him with quiet dignity. "I don't want to be alone tonight." Thomas's expression softened, the protective fierceness giving way to tenderness. "You won't be," he promised. "Not tonight, not ever again, if I have any say in it." And as the Wyoming night wrapped around Whispering Pines Ranch, two people who had walked through fire found solace and healing in each other's arms, their scars not barriers but badges of survival, testament to the strength that had brought them together and would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Spring melted into summer, bringing long days of sunlight and work to Whispering Pines. The night of the fire had changed something fundamental between Eleanor and Thomas, breaking down the final barriers of hesitation and reserve. They moved, together now, with the easy synchronicity of true partners, anticipating each other's needs, drawing strength from each other's presence. Eleanor's garden flourished under her careful tending, rows of vegetables stretching toward the sun, herbs scenting the air around the kitchen door. She'd planted flowers too, bright splashes of color against the weathered logs of the house, a small act of beauty in this practical place. Thomas had said nothing when she'd set the seedlings, but she'd caught him looking at the blooms with a quiet satisfaction that warmed her heart. The west wing of the house progressed steadily, Thomas and Matthew working on it during the quieter moments between ranch tasks. Eleanor often joined them, holding boards steady, passing nails, offering suggestions about windows and layout. It had become a family project, a physical manifestation of the home they were building together. "Thinking we should add a small room here," Thomas said one evening as they reviewed his rough plans at the kitchen table, connected to the main bedroom. His fingers traced a square on the paper. For a nursery, he added quietly, not meeting her eyes. Someday, if you want. Eleanor's breath caught at the tentative hope in his voice. They hadn't spoken directly of children, though the possibility had hung unspoken between them from the beginning. Thomas wanted a legacy, a future for the ranch beyond their lifetime. And Eleanor? Yes, she said simply, covering his hand with hers. I'd like that very much. Someday. Thomas's eyes met hers then, warm with an emotion that neither of them had yet named aloud, though it grew stronger with each passing day. Good, he said, turning his hand to clasp hers. That's good. Their peaceful rhythm was interrupted on a sweltering July afternoon when a fancy carriage pulled into the yard, dust billowing behind expensive matched horses. Eleanor was hanging laundry, the sleeves of her work dress rolled up to expose her scarred arm to the summer sun, a freedom she'd gradually embraced in the privacy of the ranch. At the sound of approaching wheels, she turned, automatically reaching, to roll down her sleeve before recognizing the futility of the gesture. The scars were part of her now, openly acknowledged on the ranch, if still carefully covered when they ventured into town. Robert Wilson climbed down from the driver's seat, then assisted a well-dressed woman to the ground. Eleanor recognized Caroline Harrison immediately, the banker's daughter, looking as elegant and untouched by frontier life as she had in the general store months earlier. Mrs. Cooper, Robert called with forced joviality. Hope we're not interrupting. Mrs. Harrison wished to pay a social call, and I offered to drive her out. Eleanor smoothed her work dress, acutely aware of her practical braid and perspiring face, in contrast to Caroline's immaculate appearance. Mr. Wilson, Mrs. Harrison, this is unexpected. Caroline advanced across the yard, parasol shading her perfect complexion, her expression composed but evaluating. I hope we're not intruding, Mrs. Cooper. I've been meaning to properly welcome you to our community. She glanced around at the ranch, noting the changes since her last visit years ago. The place looks improved. Thank you, Eleanor replied, determined to be gracious despite the obvious inspection. Thomas and I have been working hard. Would you care for some refreshment after your drive? I have lemonade cooling in the spring house. That would be lovely, Caroline said with a practiced smile. Robert, perhaps you could find Thomas while Mrs. Cooper and I become better acquainted? As Wilson happily escaped toward the barn, Eleanor led Caroline to the shade of the porch, retrieving the lemonade and setting out glasses with the quiet efficiency that had become second nature. Caroline watched her movements, blue eyes missing. Nothing. Not the scarred arm Eleanor no longer bothered to hide, nor the small touches that had transformed the once sparse house into a home. You've made quite an impression on the town, Caroline observed, accepting a glass. Dr. Grant speaks highly of your herbal remedies, and Sarah Jenkins tells anyone who'll listen that you're the best thing to happen to Thomas Cooper. Eleanor settled into a chair, meeting Caroline's gaze directly. People have been kind. Not everyone, Caroline corrected with cool precision. Margaret Hayes still considers your arrangement unconventional, and others wonder what could possibly have attracted a Boston schoolteacher to such a remote ranch. Her eyes lingered on Eleanor's scarred cheek. Though perhaps opportunities were limited after your accident. The deliberate cruelty of the observation hung in the air between them. Eleanor took a slow sip of lemonade, refusing to show how the barb had landed. My opportunities were indeed limited by people's reactions to my scars, she acknowledged calmly, just as Thomas found his prospects diminished by similar prejudice. Caroline had the grace to flush slightly. That was different. Was it? Eleanor asked quietly. You left him because you couldn't bear the sight of his burns. The school board dismissed me because children shouldn't have to look at my ruined face. The only difference I can see is that Thomas had somewhere to go, This ranch, this land. I had to travel 2,000 miles to find a place where I might be valued for more than my appearance. Caroline set down her glass with a sharp click. You don't understand. Thomas and I, our situation was complicated. Love often is, Eleanor agreed, but perhaps not as complicated as we make it. Before Caroline could respond, the sound of boots on the porch announced Thomas's arrival. He paused in the doorway, his expression tightening at the sight of his former fiancée. Caroline. Thomas. She rose, composing her features into a pleasant smile. Your home looks wonderful. Your wife has clearly been a positive influence. Thomas moved to stand beside Eleanor, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder in a gesture. Both protective and proud, Eleanor understands what we're building here. Something flashed in Caroline's eyes. Regret, perhaps, or the belated recognition of what she had cast aside. Yes, well, I merely wanted to extend a proper welcome and to invite you both to dinner next week. James's birthday is approaching, and we're hosting a gathering. Nothing elaborate, just a few neighbors. The invitation hung in the air, unexpected and laden with unspoken meaning. Eleanor felt Thomas tense beside her, knew he was preparing a refusal. How thoughtful, she said before he could speak. We'd be delighted to attend. Thomas glanced down at her, surprise evident in his expression, but he didn't contradict her. What time? He asked Caroline, his tone carefully neutral. As Caroline provided the details, Eleanor observed the subtle shifts in her demeanor, the slightly too bright smile, the way her gaze lingered on Thomas's face before skittering away from his scarred hand. This woman had once claimed to love. Him had promised to stand beside him through all seasons, yet had fled at the first sign of adversity, of imperfection. After the visitors departed in a cloud of dust and forced pleasantries, Thomas turned to Eleanor with a questioning look. Why did you accept? You know the Harrisons only invited us because Caroline feels guilty. Eleanor smiled up at him, reaching to smooth a strand of hair from his forehead with easy intimacy. Perhaps, but it's also an opportunity to be seen, truly seen, as the family we've become. Not as objects of pity or speculation, but as husband and wife building a life together. Thomas studied her face, understanding dawning in his eyes. You want to face them directly, the people who judged us both. I'm tired of hiding, Thomas, Eleanor said simply. Even in small ways, like avoiding social gatherings or covering my arm on hot days. The fire took enough from both of us. I won't let it take our dignity or our place in this community. A slow smile transformed Thomas's weathered face, pride shining in his eyes. You're a remarkable woman, Eleanor Cooper, and you're a remarkable man, she replied, rising on tiptoe to press a kiss to his lips. Now, help me bring in this laundry before the dust settles on it again. The night of the Harrison dinner arrived with an unseasonable coolness that suggested autumn wasn't far behind. Eleanor dressed with particular care, choosing the blue dress she'd worn for their wedding, freshly pressed and adorned with a new lace collar she'd ordered from a catalogue. Thomas watched her from the bed as she arranged her hair, his expression soft with an emotion that made her heart flutter. You look beautiful, he said simply. Eleanor turned to face him fully, allowing him to see her scarred profile without the self-consciousness that had once plagued her. Do I? Yes, Thomas said without hesitation. Inside and out. They rode into town with the first stars appearing. The wagon freshly painted, their clothes clean and pressed, heads held high. The Harrison home stood at the edge of town, an imposing two-story structure that spoke of Eastern wealth transplanted to Wyoming soil. Eleanor felt Thomas tense as they approached, knew he was remembering previous visits, previous hopes tied to this house and the family within. She squeezed his hand. We face it together. The party was already underway when they arrived, laughter and piano music spilling from open windows into the cool evening air. Their entrance caused a momentary lull in conversation, heads turning, evaluations made before social masks resumed. Margaret Hayes's pinched smile, Caroline's carefully composed welcome, James Harrison's awkward deference to the man who might have been his stepfather in another life. But there were genuine greetings too. Sarah Jenkins's warm embrace, Dr. Grant's respectful nod, Clara Wilson's enthusiastic tour of the refreshment table. The community had begun to accept them, not just as curiosities, but as neighbors, as people with value beyond their scars. Dinner was an elaborate affair, with fine china and crystal glassware that reminded Eleanor of Boston society dinners she'd once attended. She handled the unfamiliar array of cutlery with the grace her mother had instilled in her, aware of Margaret Hayes's eyes watching for any misstep, any confirmation that the scarred schoolteacher was out of her depth. Conversation flowed around them, carefully steered towards safe topics, weather, cattle prices, the new railroad spur planned for the following year. Thomas spoke little but listened intently, his steady presence beside Eleanor a comfort in the unfamiliar social waters. It was during dessert that the facade of polite conversation cracked. William Harrison, Caroline's husband, a prosperous banker with political ambitions, raised his glass in a toast to his son. To James, on his 16th birthday, may you grow into a man of distinction and integrity, carrying on the Harrison name with the same success that has marked our family for generations. Glasses clinked, congratulations murmured. Eleanor noticed James's tight smile, the way his eyes flickered to Thomas with something like longing. Of course, William continued, loosened by wine and the appreciative audience. A young man needs proper guidance, proper examples. His gaze drifted meaningfully toward Thomas. Fortunate indeed are those born to advantage rather than hardship. A tense silence fell over the table. Thomas's jaw tightened, his scarred hand curling into a fist beneath the tablecloth. Eleanor slipped her hand over his, feeling the rigid tendons beneath her fingers. I believe, she said clearly into the silence, that hardship reveals character rather than defining it. Some of the finest people I've known faced terrible adversity with courage and grace. She smiled directly at James Harrison, and some of the most valuable lessons come from unexpected teachers. The boy straightened slightly, something kindling in his eyes at her words. William Harrison's face darkened. Mrs. Cooper, while your sentiment is charming, reality demands we recognize that success follows advantage. Thomas's situation is the unfortunate result of impulsive choices, a lesson perhaps, but hardly an example to follow. Before Eleanor could respond, Thomas's voice cut through the tension, calm and measured. My situation, Harrison, is the result of valuing something beyond myself. Not every man understands that. His gaze moved to James. But recognizing what truly matters, that's the foundation of any worthwhile legacy. The boy nodded almost imperceptibly, understanding passing between them in a moment of connection that transcended social barriers and family histories. Caroline, sensing the dangerous currents, quickly steered the conversation towards safer topics, but the moment had left its mark. As the evening drew to a close, young James approached Thomas and Eleanor as they prepared to depart. Mr. Cooper, he said with awkward formality, I wondered if, that is, I'm interested in horsemanship. Mother mentioned you breed some of the finest quarter horses in the territory. Thomas studied the boy thoughtfully. I do, looking to learn. James nodded eagerly. Father's horses are for carriages. I want to understand working stock. Stop by the ranch sometime, Thomas offered, his tone warming. I'll show you what makes a good cow pony. The invitation, simple as it was, represented something profound, a hand extended across the divisions of the past, a recognition of value that transcended old wounds. As they drove home beneath a canopy of stars, Eleanor rested her head against Thomas's shoulder, contentment spreading through her despite the mixed success of the evening. "You were right," Thomas said after a comfortable silence, "about facing them, about being seen." Eleanor smiled into the darkness. "We've nothing to hide, Thomas, nothing to be ashamed of." "No," he agreed, his arm tightening around her. "The opposite, in fact." The words he'd never directly spoken hung between them, as tangible as the stars overhead. Eleanor tilted her face up to his. "What do you mean?" Thomas drew the wagon to a halt, turning to look at her fully in the starlight. "I mean that what began as a practical arrangement has become the greatest blessing of my life." His hand, the scarred one that had once caused him such shame, gently cradled her face. "I love you, Eleanor Cooper, not despite your scars, but with them, because of all they taught you, all they reveal about your courage." Tears stung Eleanor's eyes, joy expanding through her chest until she thought it might burst. "And I love you, Thomas Cooper, with everything I am, everything I have." Their kiss beneath the Wyoming stars sealed a promise begun months earlier on the porch of a half-rebuilt ranch house. A promise not of perfection, but of acceptance, not of ease, but of partnership through whatever life might bring. When they finally continued toward home, toward Whispering Pines, with its gardens and mending fences and half-completed west wing, Eleanor knew with bone-deep certainty that she had found what so many never discover, a love that saw beyond surface, beauty to the deeper beauty of the soul, a love built not on fleeting passion but on enduring respect, a love that had emerged from the ashes of their former lives like something precious and unbreakable. The scars remained, would always remain, but they had become not wounds but medals of honor, testaments to fires survived and beauty reclaimed. And in each other's eyes, they found not pity, not tolerance, but true recognition of their complete and perfect worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.